Log Horizon, Vol.1, Ch.5, Part 1. Serara was hiding in one of the many simple insulated houses in Susukino. About the size of a normal 2-bedroom apartment, it had been built inside an abandoned building. The enormous structures that were scattered across this world were remnants of the culture of the old era, which had been lost when the world collapsed. Of course, as a player, Serara knew the world design had been based on contemporary Japan. Susukino's model was the Sapporo neighborhood of the same name, and the player town held traces of the real city. In the real world, Susukino was a red light district, and the city held lots of mixed-use buildings. In Elder Tales, the city design had been modified to consist mostly of fortress-like buildings, reinforced with rough blue steel. The design motif for Hokkaido, or in Elder Tales terms, the Ezo Empire, had a boxy retro machine empire feel to it. Its buildings, their steel frames reinforced with screws and enormous nuts and bolts, stood up well to the wind and snow, but they did nothing to keep out the bitter cold of winter. To cope, the people of Susukino had taken to building new houses of insulated materials inside the fortress-like mixed-use buildings. These smaller houses were created with an emphasis on warmth and livability. In terms of area per resident, it was terribly inefficient, and it wouldn't have been practical in the real-world Japan, but it was perfectly possible in the Elder Tales game world. Serara had been using one of these insulated houses as a hideaway. Her roommate, the person who had rescued her, had rented it for the two of them, and all day long she cleaned the house's 2 connecting common rooms. It wasn't that she particularly liked cleaning, and the house certainly wasn't that cluttered or dirty. There was just nothing else to do. TV and the internet didn't exist in this world, which meant that killing time was no easy task. Besides, Serara was a housekeeper. That particular subclass granted players special skills for cleaning zones, taking care of small articles, and maintaining all sorts of supplies and furnishings.
Why on earth did I choose such a minor, useless subclass?
Serara sighed. She'd sighed so often now that she'd completely lost track of how often, and even then she kept right on cleaning. In Elder Tales, main classes were selected when players created their characters, and they couldn't be changed later. However, if a player could stand to see their subclass experience points reset to 0, they could change subclasses with relative ease. Serara's main class was Druid, one of the recovery classes. Serara had started playing this game, which other people said was deep and complex, because she thought it would be fun to play Merchant. There were lots of players who played this way. There was a unique pleasure in interacting with other players and saving up money, and it was just one of the many playstyles in Elder Tales. Of course, players who were playing as merchants generally chose merchant or accountant subclasses, since these subclasses granted bonuses with regard to business deals and let players get slight discounts when trading with non-player characters. A production-related subclass would have been another sound option. Playing as a merchant while making a variety of items was one of the major ways to play Elder Tales. However, Serara had checked an introductory site when she started playing the game, and it had told her that in order to become a merchant or accountant, one's ability score needed to be above a certain level, and a quest had to be completed. It also said that it was hard to advance in the production subclasses if a player didn't have at least a little capital to buy materials. In that case, the best plan was for her to save up some money while she leveled up her main class Druid, then switch to another subclass when she gained a bit of leeway. Whether she ended up buying in wares or just making purchases somewhere, she'd have assets and her main class level, and it wasn't as though they'd get in the way. And so she'd pick the easiest looking subclass, just to fill in the category, and that subclass had been Housekeeper. In other words, Serara had become a housekeeper nearly by chance, simply because it was the only option that hadn't been eliminated.
If I'd known this was going to happen, I would have picked a production subclass even if I couldn't level it up for a while. Artificer would have been nice, or Tailor.
As her thoughts ran in circles, Serara wiped down the table with a dry cloth. The interior of the simple house looked rustic. More accurately, it was rustic. It was built of wood. Beautiful wood grain patterns were visible in the floorboards, there was a wooden inset ceiling, and the walls looked like they belonged to a log cabin. The Ezo Empire was a treasure trove of natural resources, and it was known as one of the most prominent mining and forestry areas on the Japanese server. Both the floorboards and the deep amber table were practically Ezo Empire's specialty products, and a careful polishing was all it took to give them a lustrous shine. Serara, a plain girl in a loose flannel shirt and jeans with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, worked her way carefully around the log house. She wore no makeup, and although she wasn't a rare beauty, she had a fresh, neat air about her. She could easily have been mistaken for a young wife.
I'm so bored that I keep accidentally leveling up too.
Serara sighed and opened her menu. She'd gotten more housekeeper experience points today. Subclass levels and experience points were completely independent from the main class, and the system was very simple. Every time you accumulated 10 points of experience, you leveled up. The maximum level was probably 90 or 100. She'd been leveling up at an astounding pace lately, gaining 3 levels nearly every day. Yesterday, her housekeeper level had been 42, and today it was already 44. If she kept this up, she'd complete her housekeeper class while she was lying low in Susukino.
Please don't let me max out my skills while I'm living like a hermit. That would just be sad.
Anybody who cleaned and did laundry and chores all day, every day, was bound to level up. Even Serara thought this was really more like being a housewife than a housekeeper. To a girl of her age, the word had quite a pleasant ring to it, but the embarrassment was stronger.
Look at you, you lucky thing. A young lady tidying the house for a new cat husband. Kidding, I'm kidding!
Having managed to embarrass herself, Serara began busily polishing dishes. As far as ways to kill time, it wasn't the sort of thing that would disturb other people, and a casual observer would have called the scene peaceful. Serara, are you there? I'm home. The door opened. The house was an independent zone, which they were renting by the month, so only registered players could enter, and a very odd man came in. He was a felinoid. Felinoids were demi-humans with cat-like characteristics, and one of the 8 playable races in Elder Tales. His slender build and green corduroy jacket made him look like a medieval musketeer from a children's picture book. His long, thin arms and legs made him seem incredibly slim. His round head, topped with 2 triangular ears, could have easily been the head of a mischievous cat from a fairy tale, and the whiskers that stuck out on either side were simultaneously gallant and cute. His name was Nyanta.
Welcome back, Nyanta!
Serara ducked her head in a little bow.
How was the town?
Nyanta tilted his head a bit to one side and gave an ambiguous smile. His eyes were already slightly narrowed, as if he were smiling. It gave him a reassuring air, but it made it hard for Serara to read the nuances of his expression. Same as usual. Not too good, not too bad. At his word, Serara's face clouded. Nyanta might have said not too bad, but if things hadn't gotten any better, it still meant that they were pretty bad. Public order in Susukino was steadily deteriorating. Since the population was small, its self-purification function wasn't functioning. Right now, the only law in Susukino was the law of the jungle. A large part of the problem was one guild known as the Brigadiers. The guild was made up of notorious players who'd been run out of Akiba and Minami, and even when Elder Tales was a game, it hadn't had a good reputation. The Brigadiers had always put profit above everything else and run roughshod over other players, and when the catastrophe hit, they'd become something next door to a real gang of bandits practically overnight. Player kills were an everyday thing for them. Sometimes they weren't satisfied with the items they got from player killing, only half of whatever the player had been carrying, and used intimidation or persistent harassment to extort money and goods from other players. Their abuse even extended to non-player characters. As a general rule, there was no reason for non-player characters to be targeted for ill treatment. For example, the guards who protected non-combat zones had high levels and strong combat abilities, so they could easily beat back any attack from a normal player. The non-player characters in field zones, such as traveling merchants, farm folk, and town residents who gave hints about quests, had very low combat abilities and were unable to defend themselves, but they didn't have the sort of property a player would have. On top of that, since some non-player characters did provide hints about quests, most players would never consider attacking them. However, the Brigadiers didn't care. Not only that, but they'd begun to do something that rendered even the non-player characters' lack of property meaningless. They'd turned the non-player characters into property. In other words, they'd become slave traders. In Elder Tales, as in other games, it was possible for players to employ non-player characters. There were all sorts of reasons for doing this, but the most common one was to hire someone to take care of your house. In Elder Tales, where players could buy horses, there was a steady demand for people to clean and manage personal residences. Whether you were buying or renting, if you didn't regularly clean the zone where you lived, the maintenance fees went up. Non-player characters with certain types of special abilities could be very useful in guild activities, although they couldn't be taken into battle. It wasn't at all unusual to employ non-player characters this way. One of the reasons Serara's housekeeper subclass was such a minor one was that non-player characters could do the job just as well. If you employed a maid non-player character, for example, for about 800 gold coins a month, any dwelling up to the size of a small manor would be kept neat and tidy at all times. No wonder fewer players were seeking to level up their housekeeper skills. Of course, even if it was exquisitely designed, Elder Tales was only an online RPG. Maids, harvesters, assistants, and a few other exceptional non-player characters would use their special abilities to help players, but they were the minority. Ordinary non-player characters couldn't be hired. Although their models were the same as the ones used for player characters, their communication abilities were limited to elementary AI, and they couldn't do anything except give preset keyword information or fill in their side of a multiple-choice directed conversation. In other words, they shouldn't have been worth attacking. However, the catastrophe had destroyed several things that had been once common knowledge. The game had turned real, and daily routine had become a nightmare. Since the catastrophe, it would have been just as easy to count the stars as it would have been to count the major changes that had occurred. But the changes in the non-player characters had been particularly mind-boggling. In this world, they were real flesh and blood beings, and they could move and converse almost as well as regular players. Of course, unless their settings specified otherwise, their combat abilities and specialized skills were far inferior to player skills. But these days, it was often hard to tell whether you were talking to a player or a non-player character without checking the menu screen. Another important point was that the non-player character population had exploded. The non-player characters were incredibly close to human, and there were a lot more of them. When these two facts had been dangled in front of the crafty briganteers like ripe fruit, the result had been the invention of slave trading for fun. Of course, since Susukino's population was just 2,000, there wasn't a huge market. It was an ugly caricature of economic activity, not something done for profit. Appallingly, even hunting non-player characters had become a way to kill time. And, as with all stupidity, it had escalated, and the abuse and extortion that had been focused on non-player characters had been turned on Serara, a real female player. As she remembered, Serara felt the blood drain from her face. A dark veil seemed to fall across her vision, and she could feel her temperature dropping. If Nyanta hadn't saved her, she knew something terrible would have happened.
Come now, Serara, it's alright. Don't brood like that. If you think too hard, you'll be old before you know it.
Nyanta waved a hand in front of Serara's eyes.
At times like this, it's better to eat some fruit and not think very hard at all. Here.
As Serara nodded very slightly, he handed her an apple. It was bright red and sweet, carrying a fragrance that was somehow reassuring.
The house is beautiful again today. You'll make some lucky fellow a fine wife someday, Serara.
Nyanta spoke in a leisurely voice, pulling a chair out from the kitchen table and sitting down. At his words, Serara felt her chilled body grow warm again.
Oh no, that's not true at all. Not at all.
Nyanta referred to himself as an old man. From his voice, he was certainly much older than Serara. She was a high school junior, and she thought he could easily be more than twice her age. No matter what he said, though, he didn't seem all that elderly. When she told him so once, he'd said,
"That's just the game graphics."
But Serara didn't think so at all.
Nyanta must be a dashing middle-aged man. I'm sure of it. He's stylish and handsome and mature and eloquent.
Yes, it was a game, and yes, the graphics were designed to be beautiful. But as far as Serara was concerned, once you started playing alongside someone, appearance didn't matter at all. In the post-catastrophe world, that went double. Since she'd been living with Nyanta, even though it was only because it was an emergency, she'd gotten to know him very well. Nyanta seemed like a reliable, mature man. Although there was nothing rough about him at all, being around him was oddly reassuring, as if she knew she'd be protected. His bushy, marvelous silver ears could have belonged to a purebred cat, and his slim build was quite smart.
The only trouble is, since Nyanta's so stylish, I look chunky when we're together. I am a bit pudgy, I guess.
Most people would have said that Serara simply had a womanly figure, but Nyanta seemed to give her a bit of a complex. On the other hand, although Nyanta had a considerable amount of muscle on him, at first glance he seemed to have been put together from pencils.
Any news from the rescue party?
Nyanta asked this as he unpacked his shopping bag at the table. Both Serara and Nyanta knew that the Crescent Moon League, Serara's guild, was sending a rescue squad of 3 players from Akiba to Susukino, and it had been a common topic of discussion lately. The squad was traveling so rapidly that even Nyanta was impressed. Although Serara couldn't contact them directly, Maryelle, the Crescent Moon League guildmaster, called her several times a day with updates, so Serara knew roughly where they were.
Yes, they're almost here. She said that they should arrive sometime before noon tomorrow,
Serara reported. Once the rescue party arrived, she'd go back to Akiba with them. She couldn't stay in a place like Susukino forever. But what would Nyanta do? Serara still wasn't able to ask him. Nyanta had saved her because he was a good man, not because he wanted anything, and Serara didn't know how much she could hope for from him. She felt as if she'd already received far more than she could repay, but every time she brought it up, he just smiled and dodged the question, saying,
"It is the duty and the pleasure of the elderly to help young people."
It's very nice of him to say so, but it does mean he's treating me like a kid.
Just a little more patience then. I'm sure it's been rough on Mew, being cooped up in this tiny house, but it won't be much longer now. Don't worry, they'll get Mew out and home safely.
At Nyanta's smile, Serara lost another chance to ask him. To read along with audio light novel Log Horizon or to read on your own time, buy the light novel.